Chris Wideawake was nice enough to come here. I'm really bad at introductions, so I'll just let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate you having me here tonight. Yeah, my name's Chris Wideawake. I own Phototech with my father, and we're a local camera store. But we do a lot of one-on-one instruction with people, and one of the things we do is go through the basics of cameras with people. So I was asked to come and kind of show that here tonight. So that's what I was going to give you a little sense of. But my real background is in photography, and I don't dabble too much into video at all, or motion images. So hopefully I can cover the basics of what we're going to deal with tonight, apply in both realms. But I'll try to make it a little more specific to video, even though my presentation is one that I use regularly for still images. So just to get started, normally we're dealing with different parts of the camera, and the three main parts that are that you'll see are the sensor or your film, which is usually for many of the systems is we're seeing sensors now, film not so much, but I do make this for both film users as well. Then the second is the shutter, and that's something that for some digital systems, especially in video, isn't used as often, but there's still an electronic version of it. And then the aperture, which is, I brought a lens to show, this is one of my older lenses, but this actually, you'll see the opening inside that's letting the light in. And this is real similar to the pupil of our eye. It affects how much light comes in. And so when we get into the sensor, that's where you're going to have different, oftentimes we're referring to it as ISO or ASA for film, but I think when you start talking about video, oftentimes we refer to it as gain. So you're increasing the sensitivity of the sensor so that it can work in lower light situations. So we're often dealing with a number associated with that. And again, my experience with gain isn't as familiar as ISOs or ASAs, but essentially the smaller the number, the less sensitive the sensor is going to be to light. So when you have a really low number like 50 or 100, the camera just doesn't, needs a really bright situation to be able to function well. As the number goes up, you can work in lower light situations, but there's a trade-off. There's always a trade-off. And the big trade-off there is that you're going to increase noise, or in the days of film, it would be grain. But the little diagram at the bottom kind of shows you it gets a little, it has an effect that it starts to look a little, the detail isn't as sharp. And so I'll show you a kind of a sample that I have here. This is one where I took a photo and the ISO was really low. But then one where I increased the ISO, if we look close and zoom in a little bit, I'm not sure how well you can all see, but you'll start to see it pick up some more, it gets more of a pattern in the stone itself. In certain elements, like down in here where the text, it's not as sharp. Unfortunately, it's not the best example, because as the camera technology improves, that's becoming less and less of an issue, actually. This is 6400, which is kind of extreme. There's extremes beyond that. But this particular camera, the quality's good. And I have to say, I shoot a lot of sports, and I'm oftentimes using high ISOs, and I'm always amazed at the quality now. In the days of film, that wouldn't have been possible. So kind of interesting. But that's the trade-off that you'll start to see. So that's the sensor. When you start to get into the next part with the shutter, as I was saying earlier, with some of the digital systems now, point and shoot cameras, some don't even physically have a shutter in them anymore. There's a mechanical part inside that often moves. But now the sensor's being fully exposed, and it's just essentially turning, it's like it's being turned off and on at whatever rate you require. So this shutter speed, it's really controlling the length of time that sensor is being exposed. And it's really in small amounts of time. You can go for longer exposures, and in photography we can have several minutes for doing nightscapes or star trails. But the faster that shutter speed, it's really a short length of time. We're in fractions of a second. That's going to help stop action. You won't see as much blur in an image. So we're often using that, again, back to sports, which is what I shoot a lot of. When you're, for some sports, you'll be as high as a 500th of a second or a 1,000th of a second. So, in this range, to really stop action with the player running or really high action. But that slower shutter speed in that same situation, you're going to start to see blur in there. And but sometimes that blur is a nice effect. If you're using a situation where you have running water, if you wanted that water to look kind of smooth and not to have it and have a flowing effect to it, both in still images and in video, the slower your shutter speed, the more blur you're going to get, and that's sometimes a nice effect. So let me just show you a sample here, and then so on the right you can see this is with a really slow shutter speed, a 1/30th of a second, down in this range, and the ball obviously is blurred, the foot is blurred. This is my son, and this is a much higher speed. This is probably higher than what I'd normally use, but I kind of went to the extreme to show. I mean, we stop action on the ball. You can read the lettering on the ball. His shoelace is actually, stopped in motion rather than a full blur. So those are that's the effect that the shutter speed can have. In video, it becomes a little different, and there's some options you have there, but the general rule of thumb is that whatever your frame rate is, and so frame rate is different than shutter speed, but commonly the frame rates are 24 or 30 frames per second. Oftentimes the shutter speed is going to want to be someplace around a 50th of a second or a 60th of a second for those frame rates. That's a normal look. But if you want to stop action, if you want to see that water droplet stopped in the air, then you would start to increase your shutter speeds. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Kurt. Your ISO is so high and you're shooting outdoors. Is that just to counterbalance the shutter?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because that was the next thing I was going to talk about.
When you mentioned it before, I was wondering if you just shot with it because it was the lighting indoors or something.
No. Great that you picked that up, because that's exactly the next thing that I was going to start to talk about was so again, there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off in what we had for increasing our ISO, but so to increase the ISO, and here we went up to 3200, as Kurt pointed out. That allowed me to keep, and then I needed to open up the aperture, which we'll get to in just a minute, to let more light into the camera. This made it more sensitive. This allowed more light into the camera to allow me to have a faster shutter speed that actually let less light into the camera. So it was a trade-off. It's a balancing act, and that's what you'll deal with in exposure all the time. So the opposite of that was I had a low ISO, so it wasn't very sensitive to light. I was able to use an aperture that was a smaller hole, actually, let less light in the camera. That all allowed me to use a slower shutter speed, letting more light into the camera. So it was the balance of less, less, more, where here we were more, more, less. So it's a balance. Thank you. So the next part is aperture. And aperture is really like the pupil of our eye. That hole opens up bigger to let more light in, smaller to let less light in. So no different than if you walk outside on a bright sunny day, your pupil constricts to let less light in. So the hard part is the numbers associated with aperture, and that confuses a lot of people, and I find this to be a problem sometimes. So I try to keep it simple, even though technically it's not the the correct description. But the thing to remember is the smaller that number, the smaller the number, the less depth of field. And so by depth of field, what I'm referring to is whenever you focus, and your eye does the same thing, whenever you focus on something, there's a critical point of focus. There's one element that's in focus. And everything else kind of behind it or in front of it is either can be blurred, but our eye, we perceive that there's things behind it. In terms of lenses, what you're dealing with is that depth of field can be the range of what's in focus, what appears in focus in that final image. So a small number, and I'll show you those in a minute, but like 2.8, 1.4, those really small numbers have less of a range from that critical point of focus. But the larger that number, the more you increase that range. So you may see that the small number sometimes is used where people have, if you were trying to do a photograph of a portrait and you wanted to blur the background behind and you wanted just the eyes in focus. Well, that's where the small number really helps out. Kind of controls the background so it's not distracting at all. The larger number is really helpful sometimes when you want to do something with a landscape. And I could probably go back to this one image here, where you can see at f11, again a bigger number, the background here, you can kind of see things that are in focus. But this one at f4, smaller number, the fire hydrant's slightly out of focus. The background here is a little bit, but not as much. But I'll show you in this next example how it gets even more dramatic. So this is one where we're f32, which is kind of maxing out the lens. And you can see, you can read the tombstones in the back, but here at f4, which isn't the minimum, there's even less than that, but this blurs. And even this up here is a little blurred, but this one stone is pretty sharp. And again, we're back to the trade-off. I tried to keep the ISO the same for both shots, but you can see to let this much light in to the camera, I had to really increase the shutter speed, let less light in. But the opposite happens here where my shutter speed is so long that you can actually see this flag start to wave a little bit and have a distortion, where this is tack sharp. So aperture is a great way to control the background and to have things not be detracting in the image, or to pull more of it in. I mean, if that's the element you want in the image. But there's other ways to control backgrounds too. And sometimes that can be done with the lens itself and the zoom. So a wide angle lens oftentimes will allow more elements to appear like they're in focus. But a zoom lens, sometimes you can compress the space enough that you can make some of those blur just a little bit more. But another aspect of lenses that I think is important to note has to do with focal lengths. And the part that I think is important to know is that the really wide angle lens, up close, elements that are really close to that lens start to distort. But background elements start to look really far away. And sometimes that's helpful. But there's other times where if you were doing a close-up of a person with a wide angle lens, you'll really distort their face. You'll make it wider than it appears, which isn't always that flattering. Where the longer zoom, and I use this a lot in portraiture, the longer zoom helps compress the space. So you can shorten that distance between say the nose and the ears, so you can make the face look smaller. But the same thing's true in lots of situations. And just to show you, this is a landscape shot, but you can still get the same sense. So this is shot on the camera that was used, a 50 millimeter for this particular camera is normal view. It's kind of what you and I see when we're looking straight ahead. It's not the periphery, but it's the front portion that seems in focus to us. That's how things would normally seem to us. And so 50 millimeters is pretty close for this particular camera. It will vary with cameras, depending on the size of the sensor or the film. But then as a comparison, this is a wide angle lens. This is a much shorter focal length, smaller number, and you can see how it distorts a little bit. I don't know if you folks can see over there, sorry. So it distorts a little bit, and I actually had troubles trying to make the same crop here because I would have to go actually past the stone. When I shot this, I shot from farther away first and moved forward. I just kept moving forward and tried to compose the same shot with different lenses to see the elements. But you can see just between these two, which isn't a drastic change, just the elements in the back, how much smaller they seem and farther away, where this is kind of distorted and exaggerated in its width. But if you were using that same lens on somebody's face, you'd be doing the same type of thing. The 50 might be a little more appealing. But to give you another comparison, this is with a telephoto lens that's longer. It's 200 millimeters. So that zoom is allowing me to compress the space, and it seems like all of these things are bunched up on top of each other now. And so portraiture can be used in a landscape situation, easily used like this to make things seem in closer proximity. And so here's a comparison on all three, where the wide angle lens, it can definitely serve a purpose, but depending on what your intent is, you may choose different focal lengths to achieve better results. And it's about all I have, except for questions.
What's the focal length of the human eye?
So, I'm not sure exactly what the focal length is.
Or however you measure that.
But-
What you see with the-
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons that a 4x6 size photograph is what we're often using, is because it's that kind of perspective that we see. But as far as the focal length, I don't know how to answer that one. But if you're doing it in terms of the camera and the lens, the camera that I did that with, where it was a 50 millimeter, that's a camera that has a sensor that what we often call a full image sensor, or it's the equivalent of 35 millimeter film. But if you started to change the sensor size, then that focal length would change. It would go to a larger number as the film size increased, or the reverse as the sensor decreases in size. Sorry, I don't have an exact answer on that.
Yes.
Could you compare how an iPhone uses some of these elements to do this with a flat screen like that? I mean, how does that?
Yeah, so when you get into the phones, oftentimes the sensor's a lot smaller. And many of them have a fixed aperture. So you really don't have much adjustment to that. So they're usually using a wider angle lens, and with that fixed aperture, they're not allowing you to increase it to gain depth of field. But because it is so wide, there's the perception of a greater depth of field in that, but it does have some distortion, and so that's why the selfie isn't always as flattering. The higher angle is often more flattering with that. That's one of the reasons. You know, the selfie stick definitely helps get it out there farther, but it's not, I mean, it's not the ideal, but, and in portraiture, we'd often want a longer focal length and a little more control, but it's great in a pinch. Any other questions? I know I went through that pretty fast, but
Just thinking about in producing sort of work, you know, like images, fixed images that you would do in an exhibition or something.
yeah.
The difference between sort of, in still shots, between digital and analog or whatever film, I know there's a variation of that in terms of the quality of the prints, but it's getting less and less discernible.
Yes, yes. So, I mean, in terms of printing technology, there's changes there. It is still a little more uniform than what we saw with analog process because it's not crystallized silver halide. It's actually dots being laid down in a uniform pattern, but technology is there to help that pattern be less uniform or differences in dot sizes. So that is helping with some of that. But we're still coming from, you know, what we're seeing right now is even if it was shot with film, a lot of film is being scanned, and that has a uniform pattern to it that then translates back to print. And so it's hard to get away from that, those pixels being laid down in a specific pattern. There's only a few systems out there. Sigma makes one, the Foveon chip, but that's a different animal that kind of handles the way it captures images differently than what we're seeing with a lot of CMOS chips or even CCDs. So, yeah.
I have a kind of follow-up question to that related to a similar thing. Some of the students that I've worked with, and just I know a woman that had worked with Richard Avedon and some of the work that she had done, and thinking about in school and education, the process that's going on with students of photography, for example. You know, my son graduated with that experience, but we had a darkroom, and so he learned to work with light and to see different, and then to experience the chemistry of the process. And in that process, there's a different thinking, I think, that goes on between just manipulating in Photoshop and then producing some prints. And could you speak a little bit to that, maybe the effect on people of the different techniques?
Yeah, I can speak from my own experience. I mean, I grew up in a darkroom, so that's kind of where I started in photography. And I do think that there's skills there and knowledge there that does translate well into what we do digitally, but I don't know that that's the only way to come about it. So I think that we've worked with a lot of students over the years who have had experience, who've never had experience in a darkroom, yet their skill set and their vision of how they use Photoshop and other tools to manipulate is very good, and I think it's creative. So I do think that what I'm seeing a lot lately is people who've never experienced film for the first time, but do have a fair amount of experience in photography right now, are going back to see what film is all about. And that's an interesting thing to watch people, the process for people to go through. Not always darkroom experience where we're producing a print, watching it develop and the chemicals right before you, but easily the process of shooting with film where you're limited in the number of frames you can take. It's not an SD card with 2,000 images on it, it's a roll of 24. That process is interesting for people to go through and have to think about each shot that's made. Yeah, I do think that, I think I benefited from the darkroom experience, but I think that some of the students we see are pretty creative without that experience as well. So.
Thanks.
Do you use any filters when you shoot outdoors? Because I use, well,
Yeah, definitely.
like all the time. Like I basically always have like a UV or a polarizer on.
I'm always UV because that's cheap insurance.
Yeah, right.
And I've in our store I have a little wall of shame where my different UV filters that have broken over the years, but my lens didn't. And those take the brunt of what I do, so it's nice to have those. But polarizers definitely. It's hard to create that polarizing effect in Photoshop. You just, that ability, and those who aren't familiar with a polarizer, polarizing filter, you can adjust it as it sits on the front of the lens to affect reflections. So whether they come up off of water or off of metal.
The sky, like, get much bluer, like bluebird sky is what I like them for.
Exactly, and so it helps to saturate the color too. So fall foliage, that's a pretty hot filter to have because it helps to straighten out the light rays that are reflecting off of that subject to make a greater impact on the image. So your sky can become richer, the reds can become richer. So it definitely has benefits. The other one that I've been using a lot lately too, as I dabble more into video, is neutral density filters.
Yeah, I use that as well.
Variable neutral densities have really been helpful for me because they're essentially like two circular polarizers. They work against each other, and what they're doing is helping to darken that scene. Some cameras come with neutral density filters built in. That allows people to adjust it inside of the camera, but my camera doesn't. You have to screw it on the front.
The DSLRs, you have to, that's what I shoot too. So then a follow-up is, I want to start doing Milky Way time lapses, right?
Sure.
And so what about a star filter? Have you ever heard of those?
Oh yeah. There's
And
like
so
8-point and 6-point stars.
What's it do?
So it's going to make that one point of light, it's going to give it like an effect off of it, and sometimes it'll be 6 different lines coming off or 8 different lines coming off.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of a neat way to do it.
So is it more for like a close-up or?
No, if you were doing, it's great for like a cityscape.
Okay.
If you had street lights and you're
Okay.
trying to get them to be real pronounced, or we're coming up on the holiday season, set of lights on the tree,
Okay.
those types of things, it's really nice. Milky Way, I've never tried it. It's worth trying.
And then like what's my focal point when I'm shooting a Milky Way time lapse?
Yeah, definitely. So what I find is, and most lenses should have this marked out. I was just going to grab one of my other lenses, but most lenses will have infinity. You'll see the infinity symbol on there. So oftentimes what I'll do for something like that, because it's infinity,
It's a Milky Way time lapse.
so
Most of us who don't.
sure, yeah, if you were trying to photograph the sky at night and
Okay.
you wanted to be able to capture the light that it's hard for us to see with our eyes, but it's distance away, you'd keep the shutter open, like we were showing earlier, where you keep the shutter open for a long period of time to allow that light to be captured on a sensor. Some of the DSLRs, there's a limit to how long they'll go, but this would allow you to, but you're trying to figure out what to focus on. So that's Kurt's question. And so how do you focus on that when it's so far away? So if you put the camera into manual focus, you can adjust the focus ring to infinity, or back off just a little bit from infinity. It's almost like a hyperfocal. But backing off a little bit from that will get you in that range. And then with such a long exposure, hopefully there's usually a little bit of movement, but.
Yeah, so I'm actually do the time lapse, put them together, and then make videos.
So are you stacking them? No.
So, because I want to see the sky move. That's what I'm doing. So like time lapse video is what I'm turning them into. So I'm shooting for 2 hours, and then making an image sequence. So I take the 600 photos and I put them together in an image sequence, and I tell it to play it back at however many frames per second. So if you want 24 or 30, and then that makes a video file, and then you can edit that, okay? And it's 3K usually, like I shoot 3.2, right? So it's 3K, like 3,000 by 2,000 piece of video. So you put that into your editor, and then that also allows you to do tilts and pans, and you turn it into a video. So it plays back like a video, and that's when you see those, you see them in TV shows all the time, clouds moving and stuff, but this is actually you'll see the Milky Way is going, but you have to have a camera with a sensor that's like a full frame sensor. Sure. So I have a 5D, and then so I don't know, I'm just starting to, like once winter comes, that's my plan, is to do a lot of those. Like I live up in Tinmouth, and so there's not a lot of light spill. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and like the other settings, I just got to do some research on. But I was thinking the other night, because we actually had a clear night the other night. Amazing. Right? As I went out there, I was like, I can see the stars. And I was like, but what do I focus on? You know?
Yeah. So try the infinity or back off a little from that.
That's great.
But I'd love to see when you get that together. I'd love to see it.
Okay.
Sounds really cool.
Get your contact.
Yeah. Definitely.
How is pixel related to the ISO and something that you're talking about?
Yeah, so the pixel is just part of the sensor. So that's not, that's going to be, wouldn't necessarily relate directly back to aperture or shutter speed or the ISO. In the ISO, it's somewhat related, and that's you're increasing the sensitivity of that pixel within the sensor, and so it's becoming more sensitive or less sensitive to the amount of light that's striking it. But it's the one spot on the, there's several, and as Kurt was saying, it's the size of your sensor is usually measured in pixels, so it'll be in area, no different than like a sheet of plywood is 4 feet by 8 feet, so your sensor will be hopefully 2,000 to 3,000 pixels in one direction, 3,000 to 4,000 pixels in another direction, or more. You know, as the megapixels increases, and that's how you derive at megapixels, is that area. So a 2,000 by 3,000 would be 6 million, so that would give you a 6 megapixel camera. But we're beyond that. We're 16s, 24s, and I don't know when it'll end, but. Yes, sir.
I thought it was interesting that you related aperture directly to depth of field, whereas commonly they related to the size of the lens opening, which makes it really confusing to think about depth of field, because then it's the reverse. The bigger the number, the smaller the depth of field you get.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the part I always try to shy away from a little bit, because it is confusing to people. And so, yeah, it's an inverse relationship, and we can get into the math of it if anybody really wants to. But it is, I try to relate it back to how it's going to look in that image for you. What's that going to mean? And that's where I think trying to relate it more to depth of field is easier to at least for me it is, easier to understand that the bigger that number, the greater the range I'll have. And that it doesn't necessarily, to me, it never is very helpful to know what size the hole is. But it does relate to that as well.
So it's interesting to me that you used to shoot with film, so you can only take 24 pictures, and now people, of course, are only limited by the amount of SD cards they have on hand. So when you're shooting with a nice camera as you are, and you're probably shooting raw, so you have these big files, like how are you prioritizing once you put them on your computer, like you shoot sports? How, if you take hundreds of pictures, how are you storing them, saving them, deleting them? How do you make that? That's just the one thing I think that I struggle with. It's like I have these things and I don't want to throw them away, but. I
struggle with it too, and you should see my desk. It's a mess. But so actually, for a lot of the sports I don't shoot raw. I make adjustments into my in-camera settings so that it's a faster process for me in the end. Again, you saw how the camera handled just a straight up JPEG with no, and I actually, for the pictures that I showed of noise at 6400 ISO, I actually went in and shut off the noise reduction that's a feature of the camera, and that's the result I got. I was kind of like, well, why do I even bother? So, but that said, so I think that the settings I get out of my camera for straight up JPEGs for a lot of the sports is great, and so I don't bother to go that much further. There are times when I do use RAW. It's more for really tricky lighting situations, or if it's something that's extremely critical as far as color is concerned.
So you can edit RAW more than you can JPEG?
RAW gives you some latitude in being able to adjust the image and not degrading the quality of it. But if you're shooting it well the first time in camera and your settings in the camera are what you want to produce that image initially, then you shouldn't have to play with it much or at all after that point. But that's where if it's a really difficult exposure that I would shoot RAW. And on my camera, I've programmed a button that I can just tap. It will actually do a RAW and a JPEG at the same time for that one shot. And I can just keep using that as a way to when I am shooting. But for workflow, I use Lightroom a lot. It's very helpful for me as a program to bring a bunch of images in at once. If there is any slight correction I need to do, you can apply it to all the images at one time. For output, it allows me to process out all those images very easily. I can throw watermarks, my copyright on top of photos very quickly to all of them. So I find that as a helpful way. And generally what I'm doing is I'm importing from my camera card. I'm bringing them into Lightroom, importing the ones that I edit through and that I want. I usually edit down a little bit from there, and then all of that's getting saved to the hard disk of my computer, and then that's all backed up to now it's a 2 terabyte drive, but a 2 terabyte external drive that I then disconnect from my system, and that gets stored elsewhere. And then my main computer has those in there as well. And I should confess, the computers the computer I'm using right now, my father built me. So it's kind of a beast, but it's a great system and it's very powerful, has a lot of storage capability. So that was great. That was a nice gift from my dad. So that's my basic workflow. And a single game might be 400 to 600 images. It's not an extreme amount, because there's a lot of, I kind of relate it to playing the Mega Millions. You buy enough tickets, you're going to get a winner. So when you shoot that many shots, there's only a few good ones in there. Many get culled down very quickly, whether they're out of focus, not good action, et cetera, et cetera. So, thank you. Yeah. Daniel?
What's it mean when somebody says the lens is really fast?
So a really fast lens would relate to the aperture. And so oftentimes people refer to fast lenses as being prime lenses. And sometimes those are fixed focus, but a fast lens generally is anything would be f4 or an even smaller number. So it just means that it's letting more light into the camera at one time. It's a bigger hole, technically. So 1.4, 1.8, 2.8, 2s, and 4s, those are oftentimes the lenses that you'll see in the really fast lenses. And oftentimes they're associated with focal lengths that are fixed. So it'll be a straight 50 millimeter. It will not have a zoom capability. But when you start to see lenses that have zoom capability and they have that smaller aperture and they are the same, they're not a variable aperture. So it'll be a 2.8 lens, but it would be a 24 to 70 millimeter. Usually that's a really nice lens, but a really big price tag. So.
And so when you zoom to a cheaper lens, it's gonna stop down, right?
Yes.
So
So
that
the-
variable?
That's a variable
Yeah.
zoom, and so variable aperture zoom. So oftentimes you'll see lenses that'll be, and these are lenses that come with a lot of the SLR camera systems initially. They'll be what are called kit lenses.
Stop up, I mean,
So-
right?
Yes. So they'll oftentimes, with some of the cameras that are out there, 18 to 55 millimeters. That's a very common lens. When it's at 18 millimeters, the aperture is 3.5. When you zoom to the 55, because of the change in the distance of the lens, it now becomes 5.6 is your aperture. So there's a variable in there, and that you'll see, but your camera automatically corrects for that, so you don't really have to worry too much about it. But it does start to affect how much is in focus behind you. But
Yeah, so from a video, I shoot more video than anything, and so like I realized that I had to spend more money and get ones that maintained the aperture, because when you're shooting video, you can't have that sudden drop in exposure.
Yes.
If you zoom forward, I guess that kind of.
yeah,
That's what I was asking.
that's a big factor, I think.
Now, I wonder if it would be helpful if, since you got a camera, you went through like all the modes on the top, like aperture priority, and all those.
Sure.
I wonder if that'd be helpful.
Do yours, I can show mine, doesn't matter.
Oh,
Which one you
that's
prefer?
fine.
Yeah.
So this particular camera, this is the Nikon D7100. It has, the dial on top is, wish we had a way to zoom in on it. Yeah, no problem. I'll,
Could I interrupt one, or,
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah,
yeah, or are you still recording?
yeah, but that's fine, take your pick.
Well, go ahead. So you said if you want-
so the control on top, what we find with a lot of the SLRs is they'll have your auto modes, which the camera is programmed to handle the exposure itself. You don't really have to bother with it. And that's great for usually, I figure, about 80% of the time. If you want to get beyond that, in situations that are more specific, like sunsets or snow scenes or autumn foliage, I think is another one that's built into this. They have specific scene modes. And the scene modes are great. I've actually done a few
People who don't know how to
Well, to get the most out of the camera in situations, I mean, I relate it to this is that you paid for all the features that are in here. Why not use them? I mean, it came with autofocus. You still use it, right? It's not cheating. It's just getting your money's worth. So it's so the scene modes are really helpful, and I actually
Turn down the volume.
let's see.
All right, so let me zoom out. Ah,
So yeah, let's see if I can show people here.
if you need me to zoom in more.
No, yeah, that's good. So this dial right here, you can see I should just look at this. Tell me if I'm in there. It's like backwards. How did we do this?
There is a way to flip it, isn't there?
No, it's fine, I got it.
Okay.
So here is an auto mode. This one here is a scene mode. And in the scene mode, there's lots of specific situations that are set up. And then the other modes that you see here, the MASP, those are, can you see that?
And why is it that when you choose some of those modes that the camera will not even allow you to take a picture? Is that because of the ISO or the other features that you're not?
It won't let you take.
Well, there's just certain, yeah, where it'd be like, no, it's not gonna take a picture in that mode. Could it be the lens or the type of lens that's on there? I've experienced that before.
It fires, it's just not a, well, it's black, but it's not adjusted. So what happens in those advanced exposure modes that oftentimes is that more control is being given back to the photographer. So it's requiring that you actually make adjustments to other elements in the camera, like the ISO.
Right.
That's number one. And so that can be changed. So right now, this camera's set for, yeah, it's got a lot of, so it's set for 100 ISO, which is very, very low. And that's not going to work in a situation like this. We need a lot more light. But the plus minus is, the EV compensation is off too. But that's in just a regular, what's considered program mode. The program mode is very much like auto, except it's giving you a little more direction, a little more control. So you can tell the camera, I want to be at this specific ISO.
Yeah.
The S is a shutter priority. So you get to dictate what the shutter speed is, but the camera will do all of the aperture and sometimes the ISO, depending on how you set it, but you can also have control over the ISO. So shutter priority is one that I use a lot for field sports. So soccer game during the middle of the day. Shutter priority lets me set a shutter speed high enough to stop action. Not always my son, but somebody else kicking the ball.
Right.
I can set the shutter speed for what I want, but as I'm shooting, cloud may roll in, block the sun, and now it's darker. I don't have to be always thinking about that and making adjustments. So the camera's doing that for me, knowing that I want to keep this shutter speed, but it's adjusting the ISO and the aperture to maintain that shutter speed for me. So again, not cheating, I'm just getting my money's worth. And so aperture priority is just the opposite. That's the one with the A. Let's see if I can do this again. I don't think I can. You would think I know how to use a camera. Aperture priority is just the opposite. You control the aperture.
There it goes. It's just slow.
Yeah. So the A is for aperture priority. You control the aperture. You say that you want f11 so that you have a greater range of depth of field. And that allows you to maintain that, and then it changes the shutter speed. Sometimes it may change the shutter speed so slow that if you move a bunch, things will blur. But hopefully you, depending on how you set the ISO, that won't be a problem. And then manual is just that, you do everything. It doesn't mean manual focus, that's a different button on this camera, but the M is for manual exposure, so you're adjusting ISO, aperture, and shutter speed and controlling that. But that's one that I use sometimes for sports too. Hockey, it's a fixed arena, fixed light, nothing changes.
So manuals for professional photographers?
No, because you can use it in lots of situations, but it's more work.
Yeah.
You know, you're doing it all.
Doing
Yeah, but practice makes perfect. So I think it's one of those where it's good to play with it, you know, if you're not familiar with it, to try it and see what happens. You can see where if you're letting too much light into the camera, how everything gets bright white. Or if you're not letting enough in, like I just did a minute ago, it's black. But you can start to adjust, but it's giving you the ability to control, you can start to control that depth of field or the shutter speed specifically to what you want. But I mean, the pictures that I did for this, I think when I did them, I was usually using manual exposure to go through and adjust what I wanted, because I was trying to make ISOs out of this world and to give examples, but it's easily done. But that's the exposure portions of this. This camera has other ones too. It has different effects that you can do. And we could go on all day about the options that you have inside of this box. It's crazy. But they're great. It's just, it's a good system.
You had mentioned the neutral density filter.
Yeah.
On video cameras. And sometimes when I'm shooting video on the automatic setting, I see the little ND symbol go on and off. I don't know what it's really there for or its purpose is. So if you can elaborate on that.
Sure, yeah. I'm not overly familiar with the camera itself, but my assumption is that what it's trying to do is you have a really bright situation, and the camera is trying to limit the amount of light coming in so that it can try to maintain a shutter speed, and it's also trying to maintain a certain aperture. And so the ND is kicking in to limit the amount of light coming into the camera. And that's what the neutral density does. It's just providing, it's just reducing the exposure. And so maybe that's why it's automatically kicking in if it's in an auto feature like that.
So it's for bright light settings.
Yeah.
It's just trying to limit the amount of light that the camera's receiving at that moment. And it may have the ability that you can regulate it as well if the camera wasn't in an auto mode. But that's one where it's built into the camera, which is nice. Cameras like this, when you're trying to use the video feature, don't have that. So you have to screw a filter on the front to achieve the same thing.
Well, I have kind of a crossover question for you and for the group. I have notes from November 16th last year of your producers meeting. We had some amazing people here. I had this group down on North Cart from, and just, it's really cool. I just finished this movie of Via More's story about the origins of the carving studio. And my question has to do with still photographs related to video, in the sense that B had some old slides that she scanned, and they're pretty crappy. So I did some work on them. I did Photoshop work and stuff as best I could. But so there's that idea of how do you work with the still image beforehand, but then you bring it into the video, and Ken Burns is pretty good at that. But has anybody had experience of working with crappy old images or not so good images and done something in a creative way, either manipulating the still image or working in a video?
What's the quality issue that you're having?
Well, it's just focus. I can change some of the, the original scans don't have the ability to change highlights and shadow and stuff like that, or vibrance and some of the other things quite as well as if you would have had the original image. But I'm just wondering if there's some video tricks or some things beforehand in the still photograph or after the fact in the video itself that you could make these even more interesting, like blur them out even more and fuzz them up even more or something like that. You ever worked with that? Or?
I do a lot with older photographs, and what I end up doing a lot is through Photoshop and enhancing the images to lighten them and try to see more into the shadow areas or dull down the highlights. So that's what I use as a tool, but I've never really taken it into a video production. And I'm sure there's other tools.
Are still, the video guys, are some of them are still here, right?
I would
Jim?
just
Jim?
recommend that, like, from the video standpoint, you have to have a decent image to work with going in. Like, you want it to be fairly high resolution. So, and one of the reasons is like, the bigger the image is in your editor, like I was explaining about the time lapse, if I have a giant photo, you know, my computer might not like to work with it, but I can use different quadrants of the photo.
Okay.
Because like Ken Burns, he'll use like a huge photo and sometimes he'll only show the face of one guy. And then it'll pull out and you'll see that it's a larger picture with more people, or you can do close-ups
Right.
on those people. And so from the flow standpoint, you know, the creative standpoint, the better, the higher resolution image you're working with in the video editor, the more pans and tilts and things you can do so that can help add to it. And in terms of cleaning it up, I would recommend putting any type of video sharpen or color correction on the image in the video editor. I would do that in Photoshop or Lightroom first, get a look for all the images for the production that I want, you know, and then you just bring them in as finished products. And at that point, you just want to place them and put your movement on them and time it and stuff like that. So that's what I could offer.
That's one thing I was also thinking about, getting kind of artsy in the video. Would you just say, all right, I want the graininess, I'm going to work with it, I want to fuzz this out for effect, right?
There were filters on a program I used. It was early years ago, a U-Lead program, and my wife would take U-Lead. It was a over-the-counter Corel program, and Corel makes it now. And they had filters in there where you could make a photograph look like, there was one where you could make it look like it was from the 20s or 30s and put lines in it like it was. They do have a lot of those things in the program, the video programs. They're filters that you go into, modify it. You can do it after you drop it on your timeline, and you can. There's a thing like the Ken Burns effect, they call it, where you can pan through a photograph. You could come in on one angle or another angle. You can enlarge it, shrink it. You can do a lot with a photograph and a video.
Where are the filters? Were the filters in like Final Cut or
they're in the program. I use U-Lead and I use a Pinnacle Corel program, Pinnacle, which is more of a video. But this old program I had, U-Lead 10, I think was the last one I used. It had a lot of filters in there to add a lot of enhancements to the photographs. I don't know if it's still available even now.
So Final Cut does have a ton of filters. Robert's been using Ken Burns' effect a lot in project he's working on. We don't have a copy of that online anywhere, do we?
No, it's just as well. With those professionals here. No, actually, it's coming out pretty good.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think it's looking good. So maybe next time, I think it's pretty much done. If you wanted to show part of it, we can do that.
A segment of it would be fun.
Yeah, that might be fun. Any other questions for Chris?
And lighting, they call it a scrim.
Yeah. Good, appreciate you coming.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris.